Sleep is, biologically speaking, the single most dangerous thing a human being does on a regular basis. Not skydiving, not driving, sleep. For roughly a third of your entire life, your muscles go slack. Your awareness of the outside world drops to almost nothing, and you become functionally a large, motionless, completely defenseless pile of calories lying on the ground. If you were a predator scanning the landscape for an easy meal, a sleeping human is about as close to a free lunch as nature offers. So the real mystery here isn't why ancient humans avoided sleeping alone, it's why anyone today thinks sleeping completely alone, in a private room, behind a closed door, with zero other humans nearby, counts as normal. Let's start with the single biggest, most obvious reason driving this behavior across nearly the entire span of human history. Predators don't take breaks just because it's nighttime. If anything, plenty of the animals that historically posed the greatest threat to humans, big cats, hyenas, certain pack predators, are considerably more active and effective hunters specifically during low light hours, when human vision is at its absolute worst and human reaction time is meaningfully slower. A solitary sleeping human represents close to the worst possible combination of circumstances imaginable from a predator's perspective: completely unaware, completely immobile, and completely alone, with no one nearby to raise an alarm or intervene. Sleeping in a group fundamentally changes this entire risk calculation. Multiple bodies means multiple sets of senses, even partially functioning ones, dramatically increasing the odds that something approaching the group gets noticed before it's close enough to actually do damage. This connects directly to something researchers studying sleep architecture have found genuinely fascinating. Human sleep isn't one single, uniform state of unconsciousness. It cycles through multiple distinct stages, some considerably lighter and more easily interrupted than others. Within any group of sleeping humans, individuals are naturally going to be at slightly different points in their own personal sleep cycle at any given moment, purely due to natural variation in when each person actually fell asleep and how their individual sleep stages happen to be progressing. This means a group sleeping together effectively maintains a rotating, overlapping baseline of partial alertness throughout the night, even without anyone deliberately assigning shifts or staying awake on purpose. Someone in the group is statistically much more likely to be in a lighter sleep stage, more easily roused by an unusual sound or movement at any given moment, compared to a single, isolated sleeper whose own personal vulnerability window simply has no backup whatsoever. Researchers studying contemporary hunter-gatherer populations have documented something that takes this idea even further: deliberate, at least partially intentional watch behavior built directly into group sleeping arrangements. Studies of groups like the Hadza and various sand communities have found that even within communal sleeping spaces, certain individuals tend to wake periodically throughout the night, sometimes tending the fire, sometimes simply remaining briefly alert before settling back into sleep, creating a kind of informal, rotating vigilance across the group that doesn't require any single person to sacrifice their own full night's rest entirely. This isn't some rigidly scheduled, deliberately assigned guard duty system. It appears to emerge organically from the natural rhythms of multiple people sleeping in close proximity, but the functional effect is remarkably similar to an actual organized watch rotation, just achieved through pure biological coincidence and group proximity rather than explicit planning. Let's talk about fire, because it adds a genuinely important additional layer to this entire conversation that we touched on in a previous discussion about ancient shelter. Group sleeping arrangements were frequently organized directly around a central fire, and maintaining that fire through the night required at least occasional attention: feeding fuel, adjusting position, making sure it didn't die down completely during the coldest, most dangerous hours. A sleeping arrangement built around a shared central fire naturally created additional opportunities for exactly the kind of periodic, distributed wakefulness we just discussed. Someone needed to occasionally tend that fire anyway, and that same brief period of wakefulness conveniently also functioned as an opportunity to scan the surrounding darkness for anything that might be approaching the group. The fire and the sleeping group essentially formed one single, integrated survival system, light and warmth radiating outward, while clustered bodies provided mutual warmth and overlapping vigilance. Now let's bring body heat back into this conversation specifically because we've discussed this in the context of shelter before, but it deserves direct attention here too. Since temperature regulation during sleep represents a genuinely serious survival challenge on its own, completely separate from predator concerns. Human body temperature naturally drops slightly during sleep, part of the body's normal sleep regulation process. But this drop becomes considerably more dangerous in cold environments without adequate external heat sources. Sleeping in close physical contact with other bodies provides direct, passive thermal benefit throughout the entire night, without requiring any conscious effort or ongoing fuel investment the way maintaining a fire does. For ancient humans living in environments with genuinely cold nighttime temperatures, sleeping alone wasn't just a security risk, it was a measurable, potentially serious thermoregulation risk too. One that group sleeping directly and efficiently solved. Let's bring in something genuinely fascinating that connects to historical sleep patterns more broadly, because it turns out the actual structure of how ancient and even pre-industrial humans slept looked considerably different from the single, unbroken 8-hour block most modern people consider normal today. Historical records from various pre-industrial societies, along with research into contemporary populations living without artificial lighting, describes something researchers call segmented sleep, a pattern involving a first sleep period, a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night, sometimes lasting an hour or more, followed by a second sleep period before morning. During that middle period of wakefulness, historical accounts describe people engaging in quiet activity, conversation, even social interaction directly within the context of a shared sleeping space. This pattern makes considerably more sense within a group sleeping arrangement than it would for someone sleeping entirely alone. That middle-of-the-night wakeful period becomes an opportunity for quiet social bonding, low-stakes conversation, or simply checking in on the group's general safety, rather than just an isolated, slightly inconvenient interruption to an otherwise solitary night's sleep. This raises a genuinely interesting question worth addressing directly. Is there solid evidence connecting this ancient, communal sleeping pattern to actual, measurable differences in sleep quality or duration compared to modern, isolated sleeping arrangements? Researchers led by sleep scientist Jerome Siegel conducted a genuinely significant comparative study examining sleep patterns across several contemporary hunter-gatherer and pre-industrial societies, including groups in Africa and South America with minimal exposure to modern artificial lighting and scheduling. Interestingly, this research found that these populations didn't necessarily sleep dramatically longer than typical modern populations, contradicting an earlier popular assumption that pre-industrial humans must have simply slept more overall. What the research did find, however, was a notably consistent sleep-wake cycle closely tied to natural light and temperature patterns, along with comparatively low rates of reported insomnia within these communities. Despite operating without any of the modern sleep aids or controlled environments contemporary populations frequently rely on. This suggests the actual quality and consistency of sleep, rather than pure duration, may be where some of the more meaningful differences between ancient and modern sleeping patterns actually show up, and group sleeping arrangements likely played a meaningful role in supporting that consistency and quality, beyond just the pure security benefits we've already discussed. Let's bring children specifically into this conversation, because co-sleeping with infants and young children represents one of the most universal, consistently documented sleeping arrangements across our enormous range of traditional and ancient societies, and it connects to some genuinely important practical and developmental considerations beyond just general safety. Infants and young children have considerably less developed thermoregulation, are more vulnerable to nighttime threats, and historically required more frequent nighttime feeding and monitoring than older children or adults. Close direct proximity during sleep allowed caregivers to respond quickly to a child's needs throughout the night without requiring the kind of full, conscious wakefulness that checking on a child sleeping in a separate space would demand. Some researchers studying infant sleep physiology have also pointed to potential benefits connected to nighttime breathing regulation in very young infants when sleeping in close proximity to a caregiver, an area of ongoing research that, while requiring careful modern safety considerations around specific sleeping arrangements, does suggest there may be genuine underlying physiological logic connecting close nighttime proximity to certain aspects of healthy infant development beyond pure convenience or tradition alone. Now, here's a question worth taking seriously rather than just assuming the answer. Doesn't sleeping in close proximity to multiple other people, frankly, come with its own downsides? Increased noise, increased disturbance, reduced personal space, that might actually work against good sleep quality rather than supporting it? This is a genuinely fair point, and the honest answer is that group sleeping clearly involved real trade-offs. It wasn't some perfect, cost-free arrangement superior to solitary sleep in every conceivable way. Snoring, movement, and a general disturbance from sleeping in close proximity to others were almost certainly real. Recurring annoyances throughout human history, and individual humans likely varied considerably in how well they personally tolerated or adapted to these specific disruptions. But evolution doesn't generally optimize for perfect, frictionless comfort. It optimizes for net survival advantage, and the security, warmth, and overlapping vigilance benefits of group sleeping appear to have consistently outweighed the genuine, real costs of reduced personal space and increased nighttime disturbance. Otherwise, this pattern simply wouldn't have remained so remarkably consistent across such an enormous range of independently developing human societies throughout our entire evolutionary history. Let's bring psychology into this conversation too, because there's a genuinely important, often overlooked dimension here beyond pure physical safety: the simple, measurable psychological comfort of not being completely alone during one of the most vulnerable states a human being can experience. Researchers studying modern sleep psychology have consistently found that perceived safety and security significantly affect sleep quality, anxiety, and hypervigilance. The sense that you need to remain alert to potential threats measurably interferes with the ability to fall into and maintain deep, restorative sleep. An ancient human sleeping completely alone, in an environment genuinely full of real, legitimate threats, would have likely experienced exactly this kind of heightened, sleep-disrupting vigilance simply due to the rational, accurate assessment that being alone while unconscious was, in fact, a genuinely dangerous situation. Sleeping within a group likely provided not just objective physical protection, but also a measurable reduction in psychological threat assessment, allowing for deeper, more restorative sleep, specifically because the brain could partially relax its threat monitoring systems, trusting that other members of the group were providing at least some baseline collective vigilance. There's also a genuinely interesting evolutionary angle worth exploring, connecting this entire topic back to primate behavior more broadly, because humans are far from the only primate species that sleeps communally. And looking at our closest relatives helps contextualize just how deep this particular behavioral pattern likely runs. Many primate species, including various monkey and ape populations, show strong preferences for group sleeping arrangements, often specifically choosing elevated, defensible sleeping locations and clustering closely together rather than spreading out individually across available space. This widespread pattern across multiple primate species, all facing broadly similar predator pressure and broadly similar vulnerability during sleep, suggests communal sleeping likely represents a deeply conserved evolutionary strategy, stretching back well before humans existed as a distinct species at all, rather than some uniquely human cultural innovation developed specifically in response to human-specific circumstances. Let's also touch on something genuinely important regarding social bonding and group cohesion, because sleeping arrangements likely served functions extending well beyond pure physical safety and thermoregulation too. Shared sleeping space represents an enormous amount of cumulative, sustained physical proximity and close contact, accumulated across literally thousands of nights throughout a person's lifetime. This kind of sustained closeness almost certainly reinforced social bonds, trust, and group cohesion in ways that occasional daytime interaction alone likely couldn't fully replicate. Sleeping near someone requires a genuine, practical degree of trust. You're voluntarily entering your most vulnerable physical state directly next to another person. And choosing to do so repeatedly, night after night, represents a meaningful, ongoing social signal of trust and group belonging that likely played a real role in maintaining strong, durable social bonds within ancient human groups. Now let's bring this entire discussion into sharper contrast with the modern world, because the contemporary isolated sleeping arrangement that most people in industrialized societies currently consider completely normal is, in the full context of human history, a genuinely recent, genuinely unusual development. private bedrooms, solo sleeping as a cultural default, even the basic concept of children sleeping in entirely separate rooms from their parents starting at a young age, these represent relatively modern arrangements, made possible by a combination of factors that simply didn't exist for the vast majority of human history. Larger, more elaborately divided housing structures dramatically reduced everyday predator risk, artificial lighting and security systems providing alternative sources of nighttime safety, and cultural shifts specifically prioritizing individual privacy in ways that earlier, more communally organized societies generally didn't emphasize nearly as strongly. This connects to a genuinely interesting possibility some researchers have raised regarding modern sleep difficulties more broadly. Could at least some of the widespread insomnia and sleep anxiety reported in modern industrialized societies be connected, at least partially, to this relatively recent, historically unusual shift toward solitary sleeping? Removing humans from exactly the kind of socially supported, collectively monitored sleeping environment our species spent the overwhelming majority of its evolutionary history adapted to. This remains a genuinely speculative, actively debated area of research rather than a settled scientific conclusion. Modern sleep difficulties clearly involve an enormous range of contributing factors: artificial light exposure, irregular schedules, stress, screen use, that have nothing directly to do with sleeping arrangement alone. But it's a genuinely interesting thread worth at least considering, given everything we've discussed throughout this entire video about just how deeply this communal sleeping pattern appears to have been embedded into both human and broader primate evolutionary history. There's also a genuinely interesting angle worth bringing into this discussion involving sleep paralysis and dreaming, two phenomena that connect surprisingly directly to this entire question of vulnerability during sleep. During REM sleep, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming, the body experiences a temporary, near total loss of voluntary muscle control, a state researchers call atonia, which prevents a sleeping person from physically acting out their dreams. This represents the deepest, most physically vulnerable point within the entire sleep cycle. A person experiencing REM atonia is, for those specific minutes, almost completely incapable of mounting any kind of physical defense whatsoever, regardless of what might be approaching. Some researchers have speculated that the deeply unsettling, almost universal cultural phenomenon of sleep paralysis, a frightening state where a person briefly wakes while atonia is still partially active, leaving them conscious but unable to move, might connect to ancient, deeply ingrained anxiety specifically tied to this exact moment of maximum physical vulnerability. If REM atonia represents the single most dangerous few minutes of an entire night's sleep, that's yet another genuinely compelling reason why having other alert, mobile group members nearby during exactly this period would have carried real, measurable survival value. Let's also bring in something genuinely important regarding how sleeping arrangements likely varied depending on specific environmental risk level. Because, much like several other topics we've covered, this probably wasn't applied with rigid, identical uniformity across every single ancient human population, regardless of circumstance. Groups living in environments with relatively lower predator density, or groups sleeping within particularly secure, easily defensible locations like deep cave systems with narrow, easily monitored entrances, likely faced somewhat reduced pressure toward maximizing group sleeping density compared to groups living in more open, exposed, predator-dense environments. This suggests the underlying logic driving communal sleeping wasn't some fixed universal behavioral rule humans followed regardless of actual risk level. It was a flexible, risk-responsive strategy that intensified or relaxed somewhat depending on the specific, local threat environment a given group actually faced, which is exactly the kind of adaptive flexibility you'd expect from a genuinely useful survival behavior rather than some rigid, inflexible instinct applied identically everywhere. It's also worth touching on something genuinely fascinating connecting this entire topic to acoustic perception during sleep, because human hearing doesn't simply shut off completely while unconscious the way most people assume. Research into auditory processing during sleep has found that the sleeping brain retains a surprising, measurable capacity to process and respond differently to certain meaningful sounds compared to generic background noise. A sleeping parent, for example, often wakes considerably more readily to their own child's cry than to other comparably loud sounds in the immediate environment. This suggests the sleeping human brain isn't simply broadcasting on a single, uniform channel of reduced awareness, it retains some genuinely sophisticated, selective filtering capacity even during deep sleep. Within a group sleeping arrangement, this selective auditory filtering likely extended beyond just parent-child relationships too. Group members probably developed some degree of selective sensitivity to specific sounds associated with genuine danger, an unusual rustle, a particular vocalization compared to the routine, expected background noise of other group members shifting position or breathing nearby, adding yet another layer of passive, automatic protective function to the overall arrangement. There's also something genuinely worth mentioning about how this entire pattern connects to burial and ceremonial practices found at certain archaeological sites, providing an additional, indirect line of evidence supporting just how central communal proximity was to ancient human life more broadly, extending even into death. Numerous ancient burial sites across multiple, unrelated cultures show multiple individuals buried together in close physical proximity, sometimes in postures and arrangements that closely echo typical communal sleeping positions. While burial practices obviously involve their own distinct symbolic and ritual considerations, separate from pure practical sleep arrangements, the consistent appearance of close clustered positioning across both sleeping and burial contexts suggests a deeply ingrained cultural and possibly even psychological association between safety, belonging, and physical closeness to other group members, a pattern that apparently extended its influence even into how ancient societies chose to lay their dead to rest. Finally, it's worth touching on how modern military and survival training, completely independent of any direct historical knowledge transfer from ancient practices, has arrived at remarkably similar conclusions regarding sleep security through pure practical necessity rather than archaeological inspiration. Contemporary survival and tactical training consistently recommends group sleeping arrangements with rotating watch responsibilities in genuinely hostile or unpredictable environments, essentially reinventing through modern necessity almost exactly the same basic strategy ancient humans apparently arrived at organically tens of thousands of years earlier. This convergence is genuinely telling when modern humans equipped with complete knowledge of contemporary threat assessment and absolutely no specific cultural memory of ancient communal sleeping practices independently arrive at essentially the same basic solution when facing genuine, serious nighttime risk. It strongly suggests we're looking at a fundamentally sound, practically optimal response to a real, persistent problem, rather than some arbitrary cultural tradition that ancient humans simply happened to settle on without any deeper underlying logic. So why didn't ancient humans sleep alone? Based on everything we've covered, the honest answer comes down to an enormously practical, multi-layered set of overlapping benefits that simply made group sleeping the obvious, sensible default choice given the actual conditions ancient humans were living under. Sleep represented genuine, serious vulnerability, reduced awareness, reduced mobility, reduced ability to respond quickly to threats, and clustering together directly addressed that vulnerability through overlapping vigilance, shared warmth, and the practical advantages of organizing sleep directly around a maintained shared fire. Add in genuine psychological security benefits, important developmental considerations for sleeping infants and children, and significant social bonding reinforcement accumulated across literally thousands of shared nights, and solitary sleep starts looking less like some unfortunate, primitive limitation. Ancient humans simply had to endure, and more like an option that, frankly, almost nobody throughout the deep span of human evolutionary history would have had any good reason to actually choose. And maybe that's worth sitting with for a moment the next time you're lying alone in a dark, quiet bedroom, completely secure behind a locked door in a heated, predator-free house. That sense of being totally, comfortably alone while unconscious is a genuinely strange, genuinely recent luxury in the full context of human history, made possible only by an enormous, relatively modern collection of safety systems our ancient ancestors never had any access to whatsoever. For nearly the entire story of our species, sleep was never something you were supposed to do by yourself. It was something you survived together, one shared, overlapping, collectively watched over night at a time.